people that are co-hosts. You guys are going to have the privilege of admitting people. Okay, here we go. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim to continue Surah An-Nisa, and we are on ayah number 25, right? And we said that Surah An-Nisa, it was categorized in different categories. We talked about the part in where it considered that the foundation for human rights and the consideration for those over the vulnerable, whether it was the women, whether it was the orphans. And then we went into talking about the different areas of where it was a common custom that the Arab would practice in abusing the vulnerable, whether that was the women or whether that was the orphans, and how they abuse their rights, and of course abuse their rights not only financially but also abuse their social rights. And we talked about how they had regarded women as property, and from there they did not give them the right to marry. They basically inherited them. So we talked about how Islam banned that completely and actually brought in the new rules and the new justice, the foundations of justice for women within Surah An-Nisa. So we talked about that piece of it. And we also talked about the other branches of sense it brought up, and this is very common in the Quran. So it doesn't actually categorize the surah into factors and or subjects and subsubjects and so forth. No, it would actually have the surah, and of course there will be the prelude, and then you would start talking about a subject, and then it kind of goes into talking about something that leads to it. And while a subject is discussed, then the ayat might actually go into certain details about the sub-subject. You understand what I mean? So it doesn't necessarily make it into, well, I'm talking about this topic, and therefore there's the prelude that I'm supposed to be looking at. So it will go into a subject, and since the subject was opened, it might comment on certain things, and it might continue later on with the subject that it first started out with. All right. So we did talk about this piece of it, in where the subtopic was marriage and who a man is permitted to marry from the women. We talked about a number of different categories, whether number one, he's not permitted to marry four different categories. We talked about the biological women, whether it's the mothers, the sisters, the aunts, the paternal aunts, the maternal aunts, and of course the nieces, the nieces, and the brothers' daughters, and the sisters' daughters. All right. And we also talked about the second category, which is milk relatives. And what we mean by milk relatives, we actually talked about that if a woman were to nurse a baby, that baby would be her milk baby. That is, he would be related to her exactly like her own biological son. And of course, we talked about how that would branch out for the siblings as well, and even branch out even in terms of later, how they would get children. So let's say her milk son got a baby. So then, therefore, the baby for her milk son would actually be a grandson. And the list goes on and on. All right. We also talked about the other category, which is through marriage. So marriage relations, whether we're talking about a mother-in-law and or father-in-law, that the person can never marry those categories. We went into detail with that. The other details, which is joining in co-wives. Joining in co-wives, so cannot join the two sisters together, two biological sisters, or even two stepsisters together. And we said that the main reason was to prevent any tensions happening between the co-wives and probably going farther and extending to bringing in tensions between the sisters, or even the woman and her aunt, maternal aunt or paternal aunt. So we talked about that, and we talked about, the part about many times women actually thinking that they can go utopian. We talked about that, right? And we said, hey, don't be too utopian, be realistic. And we also scolded the men and scolded the women, right? We gave it to the men and we gave it to the women. We want to be fair. All right. وَالْمُحْصَنَاتُ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ. And we also talked about الْمُحْصَنَاتُ مِنَ النِّسَاء, that a man cannot marry a woman that is already in a marriage bond. And we talked about divorce, and we said for separation or any for any marriage resolutions in order to end a marriage, there are two routes. We said that there's the route of divorce, and there's the route for khula, right? We talked about that. And we said the route of divorce would be the man initiating divorce. The khula would be the woman initiating the divorce. And we also talked about something else, which is al-fasakh, which is if the judge or let's call him the leader, that specialist, would look into the case and he would rule out that whether later discovered that they were milk siblings or so forth. This is just an example. Of course, it's not exclusive to that at all. We also talked about the different types of nikah, different types of marriage contract. We talked about the marriage contracts that are considered as, let's call it complete marriage contracts, that actually have all the different conditions, whether we're talking about one, reach the age of puberty, two, having the wali, the father's consent, and three, the women's consent, and of course the man's consent, right? So consent on all ends. And number five, which is basically the witnesses, right? Basically the witnesses. Now, we did go in details about some of the categories, and then we said that there's a type of marriage contract which is fasid and batil. And we talked about those two, that the majority of scholars would consider that the void, or let's call it the pseudo contract, which is probably maybe a pseudo accurate translation for fasid in that situation. And we said the majority of scholars actually had considered that the pseudo contract and the void contract are really the same. That's the majority of scholars. They said there's no such thing as a pseudo contract. It's either there is a contract or there isn't. But the other Hanafi scholars, we said that they had differentiated between these types of pseudo slash and the void contract, not because of the way that they happened, but they had actually differentiated in them in the situation only when we are then considering this marriage in order to avoid considering any party of somehow indicted in committing a criminal act. And of course, we're talking about fornication or adultery, but in situations where we might have a reason not to indict any of the couple, and in that situation, according to the Hanafi madhab, they'll actually say, well, this is a fasid contract and not a void contract, because of the reason that there is doubt. And we talked about in Islam that criminal law in Islam, in where it's always seeking to make sure that we do not commit any fault or any wrongdoing because of human life being sacred. So we need to make sure before we indict anybody of any criminal transgression or any type of an offense, we have to be really sure and make sure that people's rights, that people's even body, and of course that the human rights are always to be concern here, and always to be protected. And that's why in Islam the general default ruling is tudra'ul hudud bishubuhat. الحدود are basically the different laws or the different punishment rules. We would basically seek the different doubts, area of doubt, and the benefit of the doubt actually goes for the people, because at the end of the day, is that what we're supposed to be considerate over is making sure that people are not indicted by a doubt or by any type of wrong indictment, and that when we want to indict anybody, we have to make sure that the person is really, one, completely sane, two, they're aware of the ruling, three, that they were not coerced into any action, four, that they, of course, were in complete consent, aware of the action, and did it willingly. Got it? So then in that situation, that's when we're going to carry out. Then we would look for other things. Maybe they were not aware of the ruling. Maybe there was something that was confusing to any of the party. Then we're going to look into the witnesses as well. We're going to make sure the witnesses, the evidence to prove that indictment. We don't search for people committing an offense. We don't search for people committing an offense, but we would basically leave for people themselves unless this had become a public offense. That's when we would say bring it forth. Got it? So in Islam, the general rule is cover it up for yourself. Don't tell people about your offense or your sin. It's between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All right, so we also talked about mahr. Right there, we talked about mahr, and we talked about the different types of marriage. We talked about zawaj al-urfi, which is the marriages that are not registered. We also talked about mut'a marriage, which is known with the Shia temporary marriage, and we talked about that being abrogated by the Prophet ﷺ. So that mut'a marriage, that temporary marriage, we talked about that. We also talked about al-misyar marriage. Remember what that is? When some certain women, they would choose that they don't want their husbands to actually pay for anything. They just want to halalize our relationship. So basically, they're giving up on all their financial rights. We talked about that in detail. The other part, which is a very interesting one, even though we talked about it before in detail, but I'm just going to go over it to get to the other parts of the ayah. ومن لم يستطع منكم طولا أن ينكح المحصنات المؤمنات فمما ملكت أيمانكم من فتياتكم المؤمنات والله أعلم بإيمانكم بعضكم من بعض فانكحوهن بإذن أهلهن وآتوهن أجورهن بالمعروف محصنات غير مسافحات ولا متخذات أخدان. So this ayah then, of course, takes us into, well, what if the person is not capable of getting married? Now, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ مِنْكُمْ طَوْلًا, and the word طَوْلًا right there, and I'm assuming that the people on Zoom can see my cursor, right? All right, and who's not capable of having الطول. Now, الطول actually has several meanings. Number one, الطول can mean the financial capacity. الطول can also mean the physical capacity. الطول can also mean the capacity to get married. In other words, the financial capacity to get married, but get married to who? أن ينكح المحصنات المؤمنات. To actually get married to the bashful women. And this is right here, the word المحصنات. المحصنات can mean married women and can mean the bashful women. So in Islam, because we've got five different things that are considered very important in Islam. What are those? DNAIM. What is that? It's basically five different things that are considered as the basis for social justice in Islam. Number one is basically the preservation of deen, piety, and faith. Two, the preservation of human life. Three, the preservation of mental health. Four, the preservation of family. Five, the preservation of financial and or economical and financial rights and people's property. Those are considered the five main categories of social justice in Islam. Now, because, and of course, we're going to the category that is related to our ayah, because the part about family, that's why in Islam, it regarded that any relationship, whether that relationship was a marriage relationship or whether that was outside of marriage, it would actually be haram and totally prohibited in Islam to be in a relationship with somebody that is promiscuous, whether that was a female or whether that was a male. Let's give a story. The story, one of the Sahaba, all right, one of the Sahaba was, before he had become a Muslim, he was in a relationship with this Bu'ath. Her name was Bu'ath. He was actually in a relationship with this woman that was known to be promiscuous. Now, one aside, prostitution was very common during the pre-prophetic era. In fact, they even had special tents, and they would have red flags over their tents. Those were actually known to being just for that. And there were women that were just holding exactly like that as a business. It was for some as a business. And of course, being everybody else was familiar with those stations, you had one Sahabi who was, before he had become Muslim, who was actually in a relationship with one of the main leaders, one of the major, let's call her the CEO of one of those tents. So when he had become Muslim, he came back to Mecca. She found him there. And she talked to him about, hey, let's get married, let's, hang out again, have a good time, etc. But then he told her, I gotta ask the Prophet, peace be upon him, if that's at all permissible. So the ayah in Surah An-Nur was revealed, الزاني لا ينكح إلا زانية أو مشركة. The ayah was revealed, a promiscuous man would not marry but a promiscuous woman, or a woman that is not practicing the faith, because they don't regard even your definition of principle in regarding and preserving modesty and so forth. So that's why in Islam, that was one of those stories, okay? It was one of those stories. And of course, Islam was always emphasizing that when it comes to marriage, that there's always al-ihsan. What is al-ihsan? Al-ihsan to mean that there is supposed to be the principle of chastity, not cheating, whether it's the man or the woman. Why? It's in order to preserve the family from any type of confusing the siblings, confusing the rights, confusing the responsibilities, and making sure that all the responsibilities are in place. So not the woman cheating, and certainly not the man cheating. So this is al-ihsan. Now, of course, that part is extremely sacred in Islam, and that's why the ayah was basically emphasizing two things: to recommend marriage in order to recommend, of course, preserving the family to be on the principle of the Lord Almighty. It's important to mention. Remember that in Islam, let's go and put it in this line right there. Let's do it like this. So in Islam, of course, you've got, it's exactly like what we did before, kind of like science, right? Got these orbits right around. So the Lord Almighty would be your center. And in the first orbit, that would actually be your mother and father. The second orbit would be your siblings. The third orbit would be the aunts and the uncles, and etc. And the fourth orbit, etc. Now, these orbits are all going to be basically going to be determined how the relationship goes, how one, when we're talking about the consideration, the priority is all going to be determined based on the nucleus, the Lord Almighty being the one to determine how the relationship is to be considered and how we consider our priorities. So in Islam, considering that in order to make sure that the principle and the orbit is following the paradigm of the Lord Almighty, it always put in two conditions. One, that in order to preserve the family, there must be chastity. The chastity is a very sacred area in order to make sure that there's trust between the two parties, between the wife and the husband. Number two, with chastity actually comes honesty. With preserving chastity, it actually makes sure that we are not confusing the paternity of either of these children, and also the children having their rights of both parents actually being there for them to make sure that these children's rights, even before they are born, that their rights to having one, the care, the different rights for their faith, the rights for their mental health, the rights for their life, the rights for their chastity, and of course having the family and the rights, their financial rights, all of it being there before they even get married. So this is al-muhsana. Number two, al-mu'minat, the part about faith. And we know that in Islam, the man can get married to a woman that is Muslim, or a woman that is Christian, or a woman that is a Jew, on a condition, or let me say two conditions. The first condition is that she would be one of the people of the book, Christian or Jew. Two is that she would be bashful. In other words, not promiscuous. And three, that she would agree that to raise the children to be Muslim. Why? Isn't that somehow coercion in the religion? So in Islam, of course, it regards that having the faith as the priority, and that's why that if the woman says, well, no, I'm going to raise my children to be Catholic or to be Christian, etc., then we would tell the man, well, now that you're aware that this is her plan, then your plan, because you would consider your Lord Almighty as the center, you would know that this relationship cannot move forward. You have to choose your priorities. Is your priority the love for dunya, the love for this life, or the love for this woman? Or is your priority the love for the Lord Almighty to ensure that the children are actually raised on the principle that the Lord Almighty approves of? Number two, if we're talking about the other condition, if the man were to marry a Christian or a Jewish woman, she must not be a combatant. Why not be a combatant? Because if the woman is a combatant, that actually means you become a target yourself. Obviously, right? If she's considering you as an enemy, then what kind of a stable home is that? Then Islam tells you no. If she's a combatant, then you definitely don't want to go and move on with this marriage. Number three, there was a case, let's mention that case, Hudayf ibn al-Yaman, and it was common that of course, because the Arab at the time, they had a lot of Jewish and Christian women, of course, within the Arabian Peninsula, at least later on, they had a lot of Jewish and Christian women. Hudayf ibn al-Yaman got married to a Jewish woman, but Umar ibn al-Khattab ordered him to divorce the Jewish woman. So Hudayf ibn al-Yaman said, well, why would you order me to do such a thing when you know that by the Quran, it actually allows me to get married to a Jewish or a Christian woman? Are you claiming that it's prohibited? He said, no, I'm not claiming it's prohibited. Definitely it's permitted. There's no doubt about that. But because it's becoming a common practice and a prevalent practice that a lot of the men are right now choosing Jewish or Christian women over Muslim women, and we know that Muslim women can only marry Muslim men, then I would be afraid, that is the Khalifa at the time. He said, I would be afraid that that would become a common practice and would lead to Muslim women getting into this risk of losing their faith and feeling that, well, we're not wanted anymore, and might actually end up facing different delusions and probably end up risking their faith. So he did leave that Jewish woman. Now, Umar ibn al-Khattab did act on what is called Sadd al-Dhara'i. Let me write that term down. Sadd al-Dhara'i. What is Sadd al-Dhara'i? Sadd al-Dhara'i is actually a legal maxim in Islam. Sadd al-Dhara'i being a legal maxim really derived from the Quran and Sunnah. What is that? So all the different rulings, in fact, according to Imam Malik, 2/3 of Sharia are actually based on Sadd al-Dhara'i. In fact, Sadd al-Dhara'i is a rule, and in fact is really practiced in each and every single corner of even law. What is Sadd al-Dhara'i? Sadd al-Dhara'i is closing the means that lead to evil. Closing the means that lead to evil. So for example, they will put up the red lights, and they would put up traffic lights, and they would put up signs, and etc. And these signs, even though it doesn't necessarily prevent or stop a crash, but it sure does diminish the statistics, or at least the possibility of having a crash. So that's why Saddan lidhara'i, even though it would cost a lot of money to put up such signs, to put in the lines on the roads and all of these different things, but Saddan lidhara'i, the government is willing to actually pay putting up these signs because of the reality that such signs do show that they are to prevent the possibility and the number of cases that basically end up in car accidents. Now, Sadd al-Dhara'i is really a preventative measure that Islam considers that prevention is better than treatment. Prevention is better than treatment. So that's why Islam considers, when you're looking at major sins and minor sins, think of major sins and think of minor sins. Minor sins, let's give an example of a minor sin. Looking at somebody not dressed properly. That's a minor sin. Okay. Does it really lead to zina? It's not like if you saw somebody wearing shorts, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to right away get raped. We know that, right? Or they might somehow fall in zina or fall in adultery. We know that for sure. It doesn't happen just like that. But Islam will consider lowering the gaze, or probably not being alone with a man, even if that man was your teacher, not being alone with them, etc. Why? Because Islam considers that 1, your religion, 2, your life, 3, your mental health, 4, your chastity, 5, your property. Because Islam considers these things as very sacred, any direct offense to harm any of these categories directly, that would be considered a major sin. Got it? Yet, things that don't necessarily lead directly to causing an offense against any of these sacred categories, but it might lead to it, or there is a high chance that it leads to it, in that situation, that would actually be considered a minor sin. Got it? Let's give an example. If a person were to look at, let's say, inappropriate scenes, is that a major sin or a minor sin? That's a minor sin, because it doesn't directly lead to zina, but it can increase the person's lust, the person's desire, and may lead to them approaching and getting close to such behavior. then in that situation, it's a minor sin. A major sin would be the actual zina itself. So if a man or a woman were to engage in any sexual relations outside of marriage, that would be the actual final red line. That would be the major sin. Are you with me here? That would be the major sin. All of the others would be minor sins. Now, the other thing to mention is that not because it may lead, we don't necessarily, and that's why it's shortly, pay attention to this one. This is extremely important. It's shortly laid out how we would regard what leads to major sin and what leads to the path of it. So this is something that can sometimes be relative. What you say is leading to a major sin, I may say, well, it really depends on how you look at it. Whose view am I going to consider? Your view, my view, etc. So in that situation, it should be laid out legal maxims to make sure that we're not being extreme in categorizing certain things as saddan lidhara'a. Let me give you an example. Saudi Arabia at one point considered that women should not be driving. And they basically said they shouldn't be driving because there's a high chance she might actually drive and end up somehow going to the wrong place. So therefore, they gave the fatwa that, hey, women should not be driving, and their basis was saddan lidhara'a. That is very problematic. Why? Because in order for us to consider something saddan lidhara'a, we would be laid out some things. Number one, if it always leads to haram, then that would be right there. We would practice saddan lidhara'a, closing the means of evil in order to make sure, since it leads to a harm always, we would say we got to stop that. That's the same thing. When we talk about drugs, for example, the government will say, well, because we were seeing statistics when people would use these intoxicants and probably engaging in some criminal act, it's harming the body, we're seeing a higher rate in offense and etc. Then in that situation, the government would intervene and say, well, because of such high statistics, we're going to intervene and stop personal freedom. And even if we're going to say individual freedom, we're going to stop it right there. And we're going to say, well, we would rather make sure that saddan lidhara'a, by preventing the means of evil, that way we will work on reducing the increase in crime rate by reducing the rate of intoxicants and drug use, right? Well, that's not only the government, that's basically Islam as well. It will tell you if it always leads to these offenses, then we need a government intervention to say, stop right there, we're going to make it prohibited. Got it? Number two, if it usually leads to haram, then the government or the fatwa would also say, using this law, is that if it leads to harm or any of the offense on the 5 major categories that we had mentioned, then in that situation, we're going to intervene, and that is going to be haram if it usually. So the first one is always leading to haram. The second one is usually leading to haram. That would also be considered within the category of haram saddan lidhara'a. The third category is that it sometimes leads to haram. It sometimes leads to such offense. Then in that situation, we wouldn't say it's haram. We would basically say, well, let's lay out the different regulations to make sure that we're having proper use. So we don't rush in curtailing people's freedom, but we would basically regulate it to make sure that it's heading towards preserving people's religiosity, people's lives, people's mental health, people's chastity, and people's property. Got it? So now that we look at السد الذرائع right there, ladies, who's lost? Nobody? Good. Alhamdulillah. Mhm. Usually. So remember Shatibi. Shatibi is actually one of the smartest scholars, to be honest. I think he did not get the credit that he really deserves. Let me talk about Shatibi a little bit. Shatibi is a Maliki scholar. He wrote his book Al-Muwafaqat, and to be honest, his book, it is so advanced and he is so smart. The way that he laid out the laws, the way he canonized a lot of things, that he was so smart that you would really, sometimes you would really need to read the page, just one page, over and over again, just to get it just processed in your mind. It's very hard to read because he uses a lot of technical terms. And if you are not familiar with such technical terms and what he's trying to get to, you're really going to get lost. Very, very, very smart. That's a Shatibi. A Shatibi, I can get carried away with talking about him. Okay. المؤمنات المحصنات المؤمنات. So the ayah is encouraging something very important, which is number one, to getting married to the believing women that are bashful. But if the person cannot afford to get married, that only then, and mind you, Islam in this ayah did not actually encourage getting married or being intimate with the concubines or with the slave women. Islam did not encourage that. In fact, let's continue seeing this ayah where, although, like we said before, that slavery in Islam is not slavery. We don't actually have slavery. It's actually called riq, in where slavery, the way that it was practiced in the West, is completely different than the whole laws of riq in Islam. It's not even equivalent to slavery, the way that it was practiced in the West. It's a completely different system. The system of riq in Islam, the system of riq in Islam is very different in where these people have rights, they become family members, and if in fact Islam used different methods, and I would say different systems, in order to free the slaves and not necessarily bring in slaves. And of course, Islam had forbid all the different systems that were known back then, and on top of those systems is basically interest. Islam had forbid the system of interest, even though it was actually known back then. It was a kind of banking system, and because of the fact that when somebody did not have the money and went and borrowed money, and then they started treating their children or probably their relatives as property. And that is why Islam had actually forbid and brought, and I would say waged a war on interest because of the fact that it was leading to slavery. Because of the fact that it was leading to slavery, when the person was not capable of paying off their debts and loans, they would end up giving their children or giving up on some of their relatives as basically property to pay off their loans. So Islam put an end to this increase in the rate of interest and considered it, even if you were to give consent, even if you were to consent, that Islam tells you that no, you can't consent to something that is against your own benefit. Because your freedom is so sacred, your children's freedom, the society's freedom is so sacred that Islam considers that you do not have the right to end it. That's something that is God-given, and you don't have the power to even consent to giving it up. Same thing. You cannot consent to ending your life. You cannot consent to harming your body. You cannot consent on the five major things. You cannot consent. You cannot consent to giving up on your faith. You cannot consent to giving up on your life or consent on ending somebody's life, or you cannot consent harming your mind. So you cannot say, well, it's my brain and I'm okay, I want to go drink. You cannot consent to such a thing. It harms your brain, harms your mental health. You cannot consent to it. Number 5, you cannot consent and say, well, I want to be a prostitute. You cannot consent to do such a thing. I'm okay with it. You cannot consent to it. This is not your right. You don't have the right to bring about an aggression or a transgression on you. You cannot do that because this is a God-given right that you do not have the right to eliminate, stop, or even end. Number 5, even when we're talking about financial rights, property, only, we're going to get to it, only in trade, if you consented with trade, that's a different story. But in general, even when we're talking about property, Islam regarded certain rules to make sure that you yourself don't become a property, that you yourself don't become a property. All right. Where was I? Okay. فَمِمَّا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُم مِّن فَتَيَاتِكُمُ الْمُؤْمِنَاتِ. So that was an alternative, but an alternative that Islam clearly did not recommend and said, well, in the situation where you cannot afford, so here are two things. Number 1, if the man could not afford to get married, and 2, could not afford to find a bashful believing woman, that would be the only time when they can get married and be intimate with malakat aymanukum, with the women that they own in slavery or in riq. But number 1, it can only be a woman that they are allowed to get married to, even for the slave women. So a Hindu woman, they cannot be intimate with a Hindu woman because in Islam, they can't even marry a Hindu woman, only a Jewish or a Christian woman. Now, if it's really important, let's continue the ayah. And of course, I already mentioned before that in order to go in detail about the topic about slavery in Islam and so forth, it's important to actually go back to the book. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. La ilaha illallah. It's important to go back to the book we mentioned before by Jonathan Brown about slavery in Islam. He goes in great detail. It's available in audiobook and also available in PDF and available for free. We'll, inshallah, continue after the salah. Allah. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. فبما رحمة من الله لنت لهم ولو كنت
كنت فظا غليظ القلب لانفضوا من حولك، فاعف عنهم واستغفر لهم وشاورهم في الأمر، فإذا عزمت فتوكل على الله، إن الله يحب المتوكلين. إن ينصركم الله فلا غالب لكم، وإن يخذلكم فمن ذا الذي ينصركم من بعده، وعلى الله فليتوكل المؤمنون. وما كان لنبي أن يغل، ومن يغل يأت بما غل يوم القيامة، ثم توفى كل نفس ما كسبت وهم لا يظلمون. أفمن اتبع رضوان الله كمن باء بسخط من الله ومأواه جهنم وبئس المصير. هم درجات عند الله، والله بصير بما يعملون. لقد من الله على المؤمنين إذ بعث فيهم رسولا من أنفسهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة، وإن كانوا من قبل لفي ضلال مبين. أولما أصابتهم مصيبة قد أصبتم مثليها قلتم أنى هذا، قل هو من عند أنفسكم قل هو من عند أنفسكم إن الله على كل شيء قدير. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين، الرحمن الرحيم، مالك يوم الدين، إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين، اهدنا الصراط المستقيم، صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. آمين. وما أصابكم يوم التقى الجمعان فبإذن الله وليعلم الذين نافقوا، وقيل لهم تعالوا وقيل لهم تعالوا قاتلوا في سبيل الله أو ادفعوا قالوا لو نعلم قتالا لاتبعناكم هم للكفر يومئذ أقرب منهم للإيمان يقولون بأفواههم ما ليس في قلوبهم والله أعلم بما يكتمون الذين قالوا لإخوانهم وقعدوا لو أطاعونا ما قتلوا قل فادرءوا عن أنفسكم الموت إن كنتم صادقين ولا تحسبن الذين قتلوا في سبيل الله أمواتا بل أحياء عند ربهم يرزقون فرحين بما آتاهم الله من فضله ويستبشرون بالذين لم يلحقوا بهم من خلفهم ألا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون يستبشرون بنعمة من الله وفضل وأن الله وأن الله لا يضيع أجر المؤمنين الله أكبر سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر سمع الله لمن حمده الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
So yeah, we were praying, and Fatima, you're the co-host, so Fatima, do it with people when you see them. And All right, should we continue?
Yes.
All right. So then when you see this area, considering that only if they were not, if the man was not capable of having one, the financial or even physical means to get married to a woman that is a bashful and a believing woman, that would be the preferred situation. Therefore, the situation that Islam does not prefer, Islam does not prefer that a man would be intimate with the concubine or with a slave woman that that they might own. So Islam did not prefer that uh, that practice, even though it was a common practice even before Islam. So you would find such a practice, whether we're talking about from the time of even Prophet Ibrahim. Remember, Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was intimate with Hajar. So that was according to the Bible, according to the Torah, and according to even Islam. That Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was intimate with Hagar or Hajar, and that he actually had Ismail as a result of that relationship. Go ahead, my dear.
What's a concubine?
Concubine is a slave woman,
Oh,
right? That slavery was something that was practiced even here in the US, right? Had even Thomas Jefferson actually had 8 children from his own slave woman, right? So that was a practice that was actually known even before Islam, from the time of Prophet Ibrahim to the time of even before that. But Islam did not consider that as the preferred situation, but considered it as the not preferred situation. And if that were to happen, Islam regarded that she should be min fatayatikum al-mu'minat. She should be a believing woman and or a Christian or a Jewish woman, but not from any other faith. Even if we're talking about a concubine. So even if we're talking about a concubine, he cannot be intimate. In other words, in treating her like a wife, if it's outside of one, a Muslim woman, or one of the people of the book. Go ahead, Sabrina. Sabrina, you wanted to say something. Go ahead, my dear.
I had a question. Was Hajar a believing woman?
Fair enough. So, 2 things to answer that one. Hajar was definitely a believing woman. Because remember, according to Sahih al-Bukhari, when Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was ordered to when Prophet Ibrahim was ordered to take his son Ismail and go to Mecca, or the land of Becca, as to what even in the book of Genesis, it calls it the land of Becca. All right. And even in Surah Al-Hajj, it was called the land of Becca. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordered him to leave his son and even Hajar there, she asked him one question. She said, Allahu amaraka bihada. Did the Lord Almighty order you to do this? In other words, leave us in this land where there's nothing in it. And he just nodded with his head, yes. And then she said, إِذَنْ لَنْ يُضَيِّعْنَا. So certainly she was a believing woman. Certainly she was a believing woman. And of course, there is one other piece of the question, is that in Islam, the Sharia or the practice of the previous nations is not necessarily Sharia that we would necessarily practice in Islam. Let's give an example. During the time of Prophet Adam alayhi salam, Eve would get babies in twins, right? One girl and one boy, one girl and one boy, with every single pregnancy. The Sharia of Prophet Adam alayhi salam was that the second pregnancy boy would marry from the first pregnancy girl, and the first pregnancy boy would marry from the second pregnancy girl, right? Are you guys with me here?
mm-hmm.
In Islam, and even later Sharia or later legislature, not in Prophet Musa's legislature, not in Prophet Noah's legislature, not in Prophet Isa's legislature, that was at all ever permissible. In Islam, And even the Sharia of the different prophets later to come, that was totally banned and that was totally prohibited. But that was a prophet during that time, that was permissible during his time, but not in the later Shara'a, not in the later legislatures. So the legislature of the prophets that were before us, the Aqidah stays the same, the creed stays the same, because that's an information about the Lord Almighty. It doesn't change. Who created us and why did he create us, and whether there's a hellfire, there isn't a hellfire, whether there are angels, that information doesn't change. There's no change to this information. What gets abrogated is the ruling, or at least some rulings. Not all rulings get abrogated, and certainly never does a factual information get abrogated, period. There's no abrogation in one day you're going to somehow read an ayah that says that God is two, or Jesus is son of God. That never gets abrogated. This is a aqidah. This is information in relating to creed and does not get abrogated. What gets abrogated is only in relationship to Islamic or to legislature, in order to either, one, gradually get people into the new practice, or to bring in a new practice in Islamic legislature. But that, of course, ended during the time of the Prophet. So I cannot claim, oh, guess what? We abrogated this ruling. No one has the power to abrogate any ruling in Islam. There's no papacy. No one, not an imam, not a khalifa, not a scholar, not a big scholar, no one has the right to abrogate any ayah or abrogate any hadith or abrogate any ruling in Islam. Only the Quran and only the Prophet have the right to do so. And of course, such information would only be based on the resources that we have. It's not that somebody's going to come up one day and say, hey, I found something new. What did you find? Oh, a new hadith. Okay, well, that tells me just by saying it's a new hadith, you've got your resources wrong. This thing is a new hadith. Where did you get it from? There's no way that you can get a new hadith somehow. All right. Okay. So having that being said, Islam actually considered it not the preferred way to be intimate with, even if the concubines or the slave women, even if they were believing women. And that's why it was a common practice during the different eras of Islam, that when they wanted to be intimate with a slave woman, they would free her first and then ask for her consent if she were to get married. They have to give her mahar. Yes, she does get to mahar. Absolutely. Absolutely, because this is a marriage. They give her a mahar. Absolutely. Wallahu a'lamu bi imanikum. Go ahead, my dear.
I have a question about, like, you know how it's about mahar, but you know how, like, sometimes people, like, how does it work? Like, if someone can't give it in full, like, I heard, like,
Oh, the mahar, you mean?
yeah, like,
So the mahar in general, the man is supposed to be giving the woman the gift, which is the mahar. All right. And there are conditions for that gift. Number one is that it is supposed to be something that is mutaqawwim. What is that? Something that you can actually have it evaluated in terms of value. There's a value to it. That's number one. Number two is that it is considered of something of value. So a man can't tell you, well, here's a liquor store on 81st Lowry Avenue, and that's your mahar. No, it has to be something that Islam considers of value. All right. Whether we're talking about merchandise or whether we're talking about service. Number three, it has to be something that he's capable of, one, transferring the property from him to you, or transferring the ownership from him to you, or whether it's a service that you would actually have that service given to you. Now, the third thing is that if he's not capable of paying that up front, then in that situation, it would still be something that he owes you. And therefore, in such circumstances, well, he wasn't able to put the down payment or at least put the upfront payment, we would still say, well, there you still owe this much money, and your total balance due is 1, 2, 3, 4 much amount of money or property or whatever it is. So in that situation, you can still be married even if he didn't give you the total amount due for your gift, but it would still be something that he still owes you whenever he has that amount to pay. If he doesn't have the amount to pay, can you still get married? You can still get married, but that is still something that he still owes you. Now, that would be a delayed muhr. Do you have to die or divorce for him to pay you it? The answer is no. It is due when he has the amount to give you. Go ahead.
Yeah. So is it not true then that like it's like if someone doesn't give you some of it at first, it's still valid? Because I heard like a chef saying it was like you have to give something in order to make it valid. And then you can
So,
give the rest later.
right. So he would have to give some portion of it, but let's just assume he didn't give any portion of that muhr. Would the marriage still be valid? The marriage is still valid. Let's just assume that there was no amount of muhr / gift was mentioned at all in the marriage contract. Then in that situation, we would give the approximate amount of your muhr based on the girls within your community. If within your community, the girl's muhr is 200 grams of gold, we would say you're going to have to give her 200 grams of gold because this is the muhr, or I'm not sure what the muhr within your community is, but my background, it would actually be about 400 grams of gold. And every single gram is going to be almost exactly, that's a lot of money, right? But I didn't actually ask for that much.
Wait, so how does the grams of gold work? Like,
It doesn't have to be grams of gold. You can say a car.
Yeah, but like, you know how the price of gold changes like every day? Like, would it be the price of the time mentioned or?
So it would basically, that's why gold is actually a good choice to make your muhr in. So if, for example, we're talking about 17 grams of gold or 20 grams of gold or whatever it is. So in that situation, we would say, you have to give gold. So if the price of gold went up, well, good for you. You have to give gold. It was 20 grams of gold. You're going to have to give 20 grams of gold. We don't, and we will not consider the price that it was back then 20 years ago. We said 20 grams of gold. We would look at 20 grams of gold and not considering the price of what it was back then. Fair enough, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The more you
Seriously, there you go. Seriously. All right.
What did you say?
Said seriously.
Oh no, what did she say?
Well, I said seriously, Tom.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
Let's see this one. So other than giving women security and showing her he can provide for her, why is the muhr an important part of marriage? Is the amount only decided by the woman or by the societal norms for it to be considerable or doable? So number one is that muhr is really a security for her. A muhr is really a security for her if the marriage doesn't work out, or if things were somehow, to go wrong, at least she'll have some backup money. So that's the muhr. That's number one. Number two, so this is like a security for her. He cannot whatsoever take the money without her consent. She wants to give up on the muhr. Well, good for her. That's up to her. All right. But the muhr is really for her own security, and it's not whatsoever any form of a price for you. You are not whatsoever a property. You're not a property. It's basically to pay up front to give you the security for your safety, so that muhr is for you. One, if things were not to go right, etc., this is your money. This is your money, and that he has to show that he is considerate. And here's one thing, especially for men, if you want to hold men responsible for something, you want to hold them and make sure that they are considerate over what decisions they make, you want to make sure that they sign with a value on there that will come back to at them. It's not enough to just give a word, but we're going to actually make sure that, yes, you consent to the marriage, but we're also going to make sure that we're going to be deducting from your own wealth to make sure that you are putting your word and making a serious word and putting a considerable word and not just saying any word. So therefore, we're going to deduct from what is valuable to you, mister, and we're going to give it to her. And she's the one that is going to decide on what she does with that money. Got it? Yep.
Bring your lawyers.
Absolutely. So therefore, and the good news is here in Minnesota, alhamdulillah, in Ramsey County, in Anoka County, that was actually part of a number of different cases, alhamdulillah. And right now in Ramsey County and Anoka County, they will take the mahr seriously, and it will be given to you by law. Ramsey, Hennepin County, not yet.
We'll move there.
There you go. That's a good one. Ramsey County and Anoka County, I know for sure because I worked with a lawyer and we did, it was a long process. So for Ramsey and Anoka, I know that for sure. I don't know if Hennepin County adopted in anything, as a case that happened before, cases that happened before, but I was actually involved in a number of different cases in Ramsey and Anoka County, and the mahr, the woman received it, even though in some of those cases, the mahr was actually written in countries abroad like Bangladesh or India, but she was granted the mahr. But it's really important not to call it dowry because dowry is illegal, mahr is not.
You saying you can get us our 400 grams if he doesn't give it to us in the future?
You can what?
Are you saying you can get us our 400 grams of gold if he doesn't give it to us?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The collection agency will do the job to actually get it for you at the end of the day. So absolutely. And the collection agency will deduct it from his own account in order to get you your money. There you go.
What's the difference between a dowry and a
Fair enough. So dowry is a practice, especially in the sub-Indian continent, in Hindu cultures, where it's the woman that gives the man the dowry. So the woman gives the man the dowry, and that is illegal. One, in Islam, it's haram in Islam, and two, it's illegal in the US. Mahr is legal, and mahr is obligatory in Islam.
But why is dowry illegal in the US?
I don't really know the history of why it's illegal, why dowry is illegal in the US. I don't really know the history of it, but I know for sure that it's illegal in the US. Because women shouldn't be paying men? Okay.
Exactly, yeah, right.
I just know for sure that it's illegal in the US. I don't really know the whole trace of it and where and who actually made it illegal and why it is illegal. I have no idea. I would definitely like to know more about that. All right, let's continue. Wallahu a'lamu bi imanikum. And of course, why Allahu a'lamu bi imanikum? Because at the end of the day is that, of course, even though this ayah does encourage to actually get married or be definitely intimate as an unpreferred, but considered it as permissible with mu'minat, believing women, even if they're concubines. Now, scholars actually had differences of opinions on whether it is permissible to be intimate with a slave woman that is not a slave woman that is a Christian or a Jew. All right, so it's just to keep a note on that, because some scholars, they said, well, because this ayah says from fatayatikum mu'minat, and some scholars said, well, they don't necessarily have to be believing women. They can be Christian or Jewish. And we know that the Christian and Jewish women that were concubines, and many of them later actually embraced the faith. And of course, but here's one thing, is that in Islam, it is against, again, totally against Islam to force the women, even if they were concubines, to force them into embracing the faith, because that's an ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah. And Surah Al-Baqarah tells you there's no coalition, there's no coercion in the religion of Islam to coerce anybody to embrace the faith. Wallahu a'lam bi imanikum. At the end of the day, the Lord Almighty knows who the true believers are. Ba'dukum min ba'd. At the end of the day, ba'dukum min ba'd. You're, in other words, one community. You're part one. In other words, when we're talking about riq in Islam, which is slavery, all right, in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, ba'dukum min ba'd. You have to know that they're part of you. So don't abuse them. Don't, in fact, the Prophet ﷺ, on his deathbed, he kept on saying, his last words were, as-salatu as-salamu malakat aymanukum. Be clinging on to the prayers and the women that you are enslaving. In other words, take care of them. Don't abuse them. So the Prophet ﷺ was really keen on making sure that the Muslims would understand, don't abuse the slave women, not because they're under your power. And of course, Islam was very considerate over the slaves in making sure that they are getting and receiving the same rights as the other family members, and that they would not be abused. And we mentioned before that there was a whole era where the slaves were the ones that were in authority and leadership, which were called al-mamalik. They were the ones that were in power. And because of the power that they had, and they were actually given the best education. And that's why al-mawali were considered the most educated. Al-mawali, they were the ones that were given the best education. They were the ones that were given the best training, whether it's in martial arts or whether it's in different things. They were given the best training. Indeed, the reason to it was not necessarily because they were preferred, but it was one way to increase their value. But that did give them power. They weren't just considered as laborers, but they were actually given lots of power within the society. That's why they were the scholars. They were considered the ones to give the fatwa. They were considered the ones to be at a higher level of authority in terms of being in importance within the society. Okay, so does that man just take any concubine woman without her consent and without any? No, that's why the ayah says, فَانْكِحُوهُنَّ بِإِذْنِ أَهْلِهِنَّ. You don't go raping her because she's a concubine. So what do? Well, only if her master were to give consent, and plus you would give them a mahr. Not because she's a concubine. It doesn't mean to abuse her rights, but only if you were to give her a mahr, and certainly bil ma'ruf, with a way that was going to be with good piety, and on a condition that they would also be muhsanat, that they would be muhsanat. Muhsana is a bashful woman, غير مسافحات, and they're not engaged in any form of prostitution, ولا متخذات أخدان, or in any form. So المسافحات would be prostitution or any form of zina, where of course that this person is making it into a business. ولا متخذات أخدان. المتخذات means to take. الأخدان, secret lovers. So in other words, let's look at all these conditions. Number one, so that was going with the concubines. It wasn't the preferred, but even if we are to assume that he was interested in getting married to one. One, it has to be within a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian. Two, he has to treat her, he has to treat her in a fair way. He has to be good to her. And number three is that it is to be done with the consent of her master. In other words, he's not transgressing. So her master becomes like her father. And number four, he would give her a mahr exactly like a woman that is a free woman. He would give her mahr. And number five is that she would be a bashful woman, not a woman engaged in any form of prostitution. And five or six here, and not engaged in any form of secret relations, cheating or secret relations. She's got having a secret lover or whatever, a secret admirer or whatever it is, that would be absolutely haram in Islam. That's not a woman. That is a person that any Muslim man would want to be in a relationship with. Why? Because Islam considers that the whole reason for marriage was really in order to, one, bring about security for the family, bring about security for the children, bring about security for the wife and for the husband. It was really to bring about security for all the different people within this marriage bond. That's what the principle is all about. It's to secure a family. It's to secure a relationship. It's to secure rights, to secure a bond, which in Islam is called al-mithaq al-ghalidh. فَإِذَا أُحْصِنْ. Now, this uhsin is different than this uhsin, or this muhsanah. فَإِذَا أُحْصِنْ means if they were married, then if they were to commit a transgression or basically to commit the sin. Here al-fahisha is referring to the sin of one, fornication or adultery. Fornication or adultery. What's the difference? Fornication is if a virgin were to commit sex outside of wedlock, but adultery would be if, okay, the fornication would be if a person had never had a marriage experience to commit any sexual relations outside of wedlock. An adultery, or an adulteress or adulterer, adultery would be if a person that is in a marriage bond were to commit any sexual relations outside of marriage. So in Islam, if this concubine or the slave man or slave woman, if they were to commit the sin, فَعَلَيْهِنَّ نِصْفُ مَا عَلَى الْمُحْصَنَاتِ مِنَ الْعَذَابِ, then they would not actually get the same amount of punishment for a person that is free. Why? Because definitely they don't have the same rights and the same freedom and the same level of freedom. So in that situation, just because you don't have the same rights and equal rights with other citizens, then in that situation, Islam considers that what is fair is that even when you commit any felony, you would not be punished the same way either, because it's not fair. It's not fair that you would be punished the same way. So Islam considers that if a concubine, male or female, were to commit the let's call it zina, the major sin, zina, adultery or fornication, then in that situation, they would be charged with half the amount of a penalty as a free person, compared to a free person, sorry. So if it's a person that is a free person, if they were to commit adultery in Islam, it would be stoning, just like in Leviticus in the Old Testament. In Islam, if a person were to commit fornication, if it's a virgin to commit fornication, then in that situation, it would be 100 lashes. And we said that the 100 lashes would be one, there's no bleeding, the person cannot raise their hand, and it's not whatsoever to be done on the face, on the genitals, or on anywhere that is a sensitive area. Where would it be done on? It would only be done on the shoulders only, and the person doing it should not raise the hand. And definitely the whipping tool should not have any nails in it or anything that might puncture the body or break the body. It's not to use a thick stick. It's basically to use something that will not puncture or harm the body. So in other words, it becomes more symbolic than anything else. If a person that is a slave that had committed such an act, there's no way that you can somehow make a fraction of a stoning penalty. So then in that situation, that would be just 50 lashes. That's it.
As adultery.
As an adulteress, it would be 50. So in that situation, Islam considers, just like they don't have the same amount of freedom, then when they would commit the penalty, we don't give them the same amount of penalty.
What about the fornicator?
Even the fornicator, just 50. Just 50. Fixed. That's it. Or if we're talking about drinking, it would only be 40. 40. But if it was a free person, it would be 80 for drinking. So Islam tells you, well, wait a minute. No, it's not fair that you would treat them like they're having all their rights and you would give them the same penalty. Go ahead, my dear.
How about someone's divorced and then they commit zina? Would they be considered an adulterer or fornication?
Adultery. If they had a history of marriage, it would be considered adultery.
But they're not in a marriage bond.
Still, they had a marriage history. Yep, they are considered thayyib. ذَلِكَ لِمَنْ خَشِيَ الْعَنَةَ مِنْكُمْ. So why does Islam at all permit getting married to a concubine, even though it doesn't prefer it? Well, the ayah says, ذَلِكَ لِمَنْ خَشِيَ الْعَنَةَ مِنْكُم. That's just really an alternative if you fear zina. So right here, الْعَنَةَ is zina. But then the ayah says, as a matter of fact, وَأَن تَصْبِرُوا خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. As a matter of fact, if you were to actually be patient and not be intimate with a concubine, that would actually be the preferred option. Remember this one, the preferred option. So Islam did not consider that it tasarri as the preferred option. In fact, considered it as وَأَن تَصْبِرُوا خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ. If you were to be patient and not get married to a concubine, that would actually be the best alternative, the preferred choice. Wallahu ghafurur rahim. Now that tells you, Wallahu ghafurur rahim, that the Lord Almighty is most forgiving and most merciful. When you look at this ayah, it's basically to tell you that the ayah wasn't considering that that's the preferred option and stressing that yes, the Lord Almighty is going to forgive, but still would not like you to do it. Would not like you to do it. يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ لِيُبَيِّنَ لَكُمْ. The Lord Almighty wants to basically lay out لِيُبَيِّن. Il-bayan is clarity. Bring about the clarification. And why are these rulings there at all? Why do we even have rules? Why is the Sharia there? Why can't people just let them live and just let them choose on how each and every single person wants to choose on what they want to choose their definitions of principles be like? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, here's one thing. لِيُبَيِّنَ لَكُمْ. It's to clarify how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you and what is actually good for you. الشَّرِيعَةُ مَصْلَحَةٌ كُلُّهَا. Sharia is everything about Sharia is all about bringing benefit to people, bringing benefit to the society, whether in terms of their religion, whether in terms of their lives, whether in terms of their mental health, whether in terms of their family and chastity, or whether in terms of property. And it is in order, وَيَهْدِيَكُمْ سُنَنَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ, and it is to guide you. Now the word sunan actually means practices and paths. So does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala want us to actually follow the path of the people before us? So it's the way, it's the path, and that's the word Sharia and what it means. What does Sharia mean? The word Sharia means spring. The spring of water? Spring of water. Sharia actually means a spring of water. I know if you were to go on a Fox News, it's going to sound so. Fox News is just. I would listen to Fox News and I'm like, oh God, you guys have everything just mixed up. Sharia means spring of water. Yep. So that's why it's actually called Sharia, because it's the spring of water, and where the spring of water was there to bring about purification. So Sharia, whether it was the Sharia of the previous prophets or the Sharia in Islam here, is in order to bring about hidayah, to bring about guidance, to bring about purification, to bring about justice. Oh, to bring about justice. Where sunan alladhina min qablikum, and that was always the history of all the different legislature that the Lord Almighty had sent onto prophets and messengers. It was in order to bring about the purification, to bring about exactly what a spring of water were to bring. It is to bring about life, to bring about justice, and to bring about stability. وَيَتُوبَ عَلَيْكُمْ, and to bring about a repentance. Why? Because when you look at Sharia in Islam, when you look at Sharia in general in Islam, all right, you see one. Let's see, look at this one. Number one is that, look at this one. Oops, what did I just do? Oh, it was already there. Okay, so we got يُبَيِّنُ لَكُمْ يَهْدِيَكُمْ يَتُوبَ عَلَيْكُم. You got three things. Number one, Ittibyan. Ittibyan actually means clarity, to bring about a distinction. All right. Number two, to bring about al-hidayah, which is guidance. Number three is to bring about tawbah. I want you to look at these three, because il-tibyan is related to mind. Il-hidayah is related to the heart and soul. It-tawbah is related to your soul right there. So al-hidayah, heart, and this is soul. So لِيُبَيِّنَ لَكُمْ, when we're talking about legislature, there's a certain thing in where, of course, the philosophy of ethics, they'll have different theories about what makes something ethical and what makes it not ethical. So many different theories. I'm not going to go into it. Okay. The different theories, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, well, all those different theories, you can have different perspectives, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, well, right there, Sharia was there to bring about that mind recognition of what makes a fair philosophy of ethics, what makes justice, what's the foundation of justice. So this is لِيُبَيِّنَ لَكُمْ. So what was Sharia for? It was there to bring you the clarification of how you recognize the different paradigms, the different things that make the foundation of ethics, that make the foundation of justice. That's the first thing. So therefore, when you look at Sharia, and it's really said that a lot of times when we say the word fiqh, people think it's a block of rules, rigid and nothing in it. Actually, Sharia and fiqh are so deep and so intense, in where it's all about laying out 5 different things. Number one, al-umur bimaqasidiha. Number one, things are based on the intentions, in where intention plays an important role in Sharia. 2, al-yaqinu la yazulu bil-shak. Everything in Islam, it's all to tell you, whenever you want to make a ruling, you have to consider what you are sure of and not what you're in doubt in. It's all about evidence, all about strong basis, not doubt. Number 3, ad-darar yuzal. Ad-darar yuzal. It's all about eliminating harm. Number 4, المشقة تجلب التيسير. What is المشقة تجلب التيسير? المشقة تجلب التيسير. Whenever there is hardship, ease comes with it. But the hardship that we're considering is basically in the lens of considering the sanctity of religion, the sanctity of human life, the sanctity of mind, the sanctity of chastity and family, and the sanctity of property. Number 5 rule is al-'adatu muhakkima, that we would go back to even culture or even the norm and the practices that are within the society, as long as they do not contradict the vertebra of Sharia and what Islam regards as the foundation of justice. Then in that situation, we would go back and let people make their choices of what they think is actually a fair deal. So in other words, Islam is not a theocracy. In fact, Islam actually tells you that al-'adatu muhakkima, that people's cultures, people's choices are actually part of what Islam considers. So absolutely, Sharia is not a theocracy. And ijtihad cannot happen. لا اجتهاد في مورد النص. There, you cannot put yourself on top of the Lord Almighty. So you would basically go back to fiqh, to the Quran, and to the Sunnah in order to help you understand through the lens of Quran and Sunnah, 2 lenses, to make sure that you're viewing and you're dissecting the world around you and you're scrutinizing it in the right way. Now, that's not enough, because when you're talking about legislature, yes, part of it is really laying out the different platforms of justice, but that's not enough, because justice in the pragmatic parts of life, that's one side, but there's another side that relates to your heart. That relates to your heart, that relates to something that is on the inside to make a different type of ethics and morality, which is the part that what you are on the inside. So it's not just on the actions on the outside, but it's also on the inside, which is why the ayah says, وَيَهْدِيَكُمْ. So the reason for Sharia was, number 1, to bring about clarification into distinguishing and helping you identify the philosophy of justice. 2, to help you distinguish morality that is on the inside. And 3, to help you distinguish a higher level of morality, of principle, that is the level of principle in where it is beyond al-'adl. What is this? Now, in Islam, remember the ayah. My favorite ayah in the Quran. إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى. My favorite ayah على الإطلاق is this ayah. The Lord Almighty orders for justice, 2, al-ihsan, which is a higher level than justice. What is justice? Justice, I gave you $20 for this. You give me whatever I paid for. That's justice. I gave consent. I give you this. You give me equity. Justice. But there's a higher level than justice, which is al-ihsan. Al-ihsan is to put in some form of piety, some form of principle, some form of investment, some form of compromise, even though the person didn't compensate you equally with that. So Islam was encouraging that people would go at a higher level than justice. Justice is not the top thing. Justice, that's the minimum. Islam tells you what is even better than justice is when you are willing to give in, when you're willing to share, when you're willing to participate and give in kindness, even when the person did not pay you back. And then tells you, وَإِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى, and given to who? and given to the relatives, because the relatives are the most to transgress the limit with you. إيتاء ذي القربى. What about when they would go beyond the least limit? ينهى عن الفحشاء. And Islam forbids al-fahsha, transgression. 2, aggression. 3, oppression. ينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي. That's my favorite ayah. Now, looking at this ayah through that lens, it basically tells you there's لِيُبَيِّنَ لَكُمْ, that's to give you al-adl, that's to give you justice. يَهْدِيَكُمْ سُنَنَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ, that's to give you al-ihsan. يَتُوبَ عَلَيْكُمْ, that's to give you يَعِظُكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. That's what the end of the ayah was saying. يَعِظُكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. That's in order for you, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you the different details in Sharia, that's in order to give you the highest level of piety. What is that? That's taqwa. Even when no one is present, to see you and how committed you are to the faith, you know that the Lord Almighty can see you beyond all barriers. That's taqwa. That's taqwa. Al-adl, I can see, you can see me, I've got my evidence, etc. That's al-adl. Al-hidayah, all right, I'll share it. But on the inside, I wish I can take it. But the highest level, yatub alaykum. No. With all my whole heart, I'm fully going to share, fully going to be a person of principle despite all the odds. Wallahu alimun hakim. And the Lord Almighty is all-knowing and all-wise. The end of our page. Go ahead, my dear.
Yatubu alaykum is when not like Allah making tawbah on you.
Yeah, it is. Absolutely, it is. وَيَتُوبَ عَلَيْكُمْ, it's making tawbah on you. But when does the tawbah actually happen?
When you have taqwa.
When you have taqwa. There you go. When you have taqwa. So that's why we put it within. When you want to read the ayat, you can't read one ayat and forget the other. Sometimes you got to see and connect the dots together to see the lens through this ayah and that ayah to understand how you're scrutinizing these words. You're going deep on side. Well, why did it say لِيُبَيِّنَ لَكُمْ يَهْدِيَكُمْ أَنْ يَتُوبَ عَلَيْكُمْ? Just tell me the end and that's it. Wanting you to go beyond the surface. All right, let's see. Somebody actually said something in the chat right here. Man, that's a long question. Let's see. Oh boy. All right, hold on. Okay. I have never heard mahr being required. No, I didn't say mahr is required by law in Hennepin County. I said that Ramsey County and Anoka County, if you have mahr stated in a contract, in your marriage contract, the county or the marriage, basically the family court, would actually give you your rights, even if that was not in a registered marriage contract. Even if that marriage contract was done in Bangladesh or who knows what country. So if we think the rule of al-adl muhakkad, does that mean if I go to Saudi Arabia and see women wear niqab, I should wear niqab too because it's the culture there? So not quite. Not quite. I mean, it's good to not stand out, all right? But at the end of the day, is that you would basically practice your own culture, because al-adatu muhakkima, what is your ada? If you're probably Indian or Pakistani, you're going to wear that shalwar and qamis, so you can dress that way because that's your ada. You don't necessarily have to embrace their culture. That's your culture. This question is out of context, but hope you can answer at the end. Is mixed marriage allowed in Islam? I have noticed in the same in this time and age that people seem to enter marriage with gender mixing, music, and other things that is considered haram or not encouraged in our religion. Also, marriages have become more of a business transaction. Okay, and Maher point out, which is the money too much to ask for. Also, how should people distinguish what is culture and Islam, or what people seem to think Islam is but not Islamic? Well, I mean, So, okay, that's a, it felt like a whole, all I could think of is a whole, ball of yarn. All right, so let me explain that one. Let me first go to the usul right here. How does Islam distinguish between Islam and culture? So Islam would be, if I were to have a text saying this is what Islam rules, okay? Culture would be the practice that Islam didn't necessarily have a say on it, but people practice it that way, and Islam didn't object or didn't comment on anything, and it became a common practice. That would be the culture. Okay. For the part about mixing and intermixing, well, there's no doubt that such intermixing and intermingling and music and dancing and people undressing modestly, there's no doubt that that's haram. There's no doubt about that. In here, marriages have become more of a business transaction, and the mahar, etc. Well, I would agree with you that to a certain extent, that marriages have become a business transaction. I think a lot of times people have actually lost the value of the value of what it means to be in a marriage bond, what it means to compromise, what it means to live together, what it means to create a relationship. There's no doubt about that. I mean, that's not only in marriage, but that's also in family. That's in every relationship. Unfortunately, I think the materialistic lifestyle had taken away a lot of the beautiful things in what makes us human. Whether it's our patience, whether it's our love, whether it's our compassion, whether it's our support for one another. I think definitely this materialistic lifestyle and the capitalist lifestyles, had made our relationship really based on money. It's like, how much can you give me? And if you don't give me this much, if you don't give me this expected amount, then in that situation, sorry, you had abused me, and all of a sudden I would forget each and every single relationship that is beyond and more than money. Unfortunately, our society has now become so materialistic that to us it's all about the money, and it's not seen anymore as, well, your family relationship is even more valuable than the money. The compassion is more valuable than all the money. The money, I can put a number to it, but family compassion, there's no number. There shouldn't be a number. The marriage bond, there shouldn't be a number. But that takes a lot of contribution. That takes a lot of compassion. That takes a lot of loyalty. That takes a lot of sincerity, loyalty, for a person to really show that it's not about what you can give me in terms of money, but it's about what we can both support one another in compassion, in ihsan, right? And once people had lost these beautiful meanings, you could see that right now people were willing to commit a crime over a simple thing. Commit a crime over a simple thing. You didn't consider that person's life, or that person's ird, or even their honor was a lot more worthy and a lot more valuable than whatever financial loss there was. So I agree with you. Oh, Allah barik fiki ya Rabbi. So this is it. I'm not going to keep you all. If there's anybody that has any questions, even outside of context, I'd be happy to answer it. And I'm going to even allow the people to unmute themselves instead of me being, here, what do they call the person that is authoritative? Moderator. If anybody wants to unmute themselves or even ask questions, even outside of the topic, that's all right too. Inshallah, next week or Friday.
I have a question.
Go ahead, my dear.
So you were talking about concubine and marriage with them, and the ayah said, I believe,
بإذن أهلهم.
if you want to marry the concubine. But what if can they have a relationship with them if they don't want to marry them? Can they just like have any sexual
So-
relations with them?
Fair enough. So in Islam, the master himself, if he owns the woman, that is considered a form of marriage.
Consent?
That is considered a form of marriage. Yes, Islam does not encourage that, all right, does not encourage that, but it is considered a form of marriage.
Okay, so regardless, the whole ayah is talking about concubine, like there's no such thing as real marriage, like you can't call her my wife or anything, she's like your concubine.
No, she is like a wife. No other person can be intimate with this person because she is like a wife.
Oh, there's a nikah.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
This woman is not, yeah, well, she's a concubine, let me just go sleep with her. No,
oh, okay,
this woman, if she is married to a specific person, no other person can share this woman. She is married to this person. That's it.
okay. For her, okay, so the nikah is him owning her.
Absolutely.
Happens when he owns-
Absolutely. No one else. She doesn't become public property. Absolutely not.
Okay,
Absolutely not. That's why the ayah was emphasizing right there. Ayah محصنات, that they're actually محصنات, that they're actually bashful women. غير مسافحات ولا going even farther and farther. It's like emphasizing that these women, they're not being shared with anyone else, and they're themselves. We're not just talking about intimacy sharing as a business, but we're also talking about even to as low as having some form of a relationship, even if it's a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, right? Even if we're talking about that, there's no intimacy. But ولا متخذات أخدان, the ayah is really careful in telling you, no, they have to be completely bashful. Not only are we talking about they're not having any intimacy outside of marriage, but we're also talking about not having any outside relationships, even if it's outside of an intimacy. You see what I'm saying? So
okay, so
Islam,
when she gets the, sorry to interrupt. So when he gets the concubine, let's say like, he got like, or he went to the store, I don't know, the slavery market, and then like bought her.
slavery market, okay.
But he's not planning to marry her yet, like she's still like young, right? And then he buys her. When does the nikah happen? If he decides that he wants to be her
If
wife?
he decides not underage, it's absolutely not permissible in Islam.
Okay,
So girls that are underage, not in a marriage contract and not in concubine, because it is harmful. And in Islam, the general ruling, لا ضرر ولا ضرار, you cannot harm them. In Islam, if this man were to be intimate with this underage girl, he would actually be fined, or he would be subject to what is called the ta'zir. What is it, ta'zir? It ta'zir would be the government would be the one to basically charge him, or even put and decide the penalty on what he should be charged for this crime. So Islam would consider it, if it's an underage, it's a crime. All right. Now, if this girl grows old enough, and let's say she's a woman now, etc., then in that situation, he can be intimate with her. So you might say, well, wait a minute, how is it that he might be intimate? So Islam regards that there are different ways of actually making a family. One of it is marriage. The second route is basically the concubines, on a condition that she would be owned by him and would actually be treated like a family within his household. So she would have rights. She would be respected. She would not be given more than what she can handle. And in fact, even if he were to be intimate with her, she would actually be, if she were to get a child, walad, which actually means She would be considered the mother of a free child, and that would actually mean she would be somewhat of a free woman. Why? Because she is right now a family and part of the family, and she's right now the mother of his own son. So Islam regarded, well, let this woman, give her a chance to actually be regarded not as just a slave woman, but also regarded as a wife, to be given even her rights in that regard.
She grows up to be his wife in a marriage.
Yeah.
Because she's in his household. Where's the consent then?
So in Islam, that piece of it, that consent piece of it, in Islam, the consent is not necessarily as sacred as what we would consider. So in Islam, consent is not always sacred in Islam. So let's say I would give consent for you to do euthanasia on a person. In Islam, not because that person had given consent to practice euthanasia does not make it permissible. So in Islam, consent should be should be within the boundary of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded permissible. Within the boundary of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded permissible. So should the man force himself onto a woman that doesn't want him? Absolutely not. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ said that a man should not even force himself on his own wife, let alone on a concubine. You see what I'm saying? So consent, yes, it is considered as sacred, but at the same time, that when we're talking about does Islam actually allow such a relationship? Yes, but not in a force. Because the second that you would actually put it in a force, then in that situation, you had actually treated the person with harm. And Islam says, لا ضرر ولا ضرار. There's no harm in Islam. You cannot harm somebody. Did I answer it?
Yes.
Okay, let's go ahead, Sabrine. Sabrine, go ahead, my dear. See, I think you can unmute yourself. Sabrine.
Assalamu alaikum. I have my question. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
My question was, and we go to school and we're in these environments where we see, we see things we see Muslims and them doing things that are wrong and stuff like that. And so, I don't know if this is in the Quran or if this is a hadith, I forgot, but I heard that if you see something that's wrong, you correct it by your hand, and if you can't correct it by your hand, you correct it by your tongue, and then if you can't correct it by your tongue, then you resist it in your heart or something like that. Are we in Islam obligated that if we see another Muslim doing something that is considered haram in our religion to then go and tell them that that thing is considered wrong?
So in Islam, if you see something wrong, whether that is a Muslim or not a Muslim, you are obligated to basically teach others on the principles of the Lord Almighty within the society. Whether that meant using your authority to mean, let's say, voting, or probably educating people about it. So that's the hand piece of it, all right? Or whether if you couldn't use the authority, you couldn't vote against it, or etc. That's going to be the authority part of it. And then the second one would be to say something about it, educate people about it, use your word, a kind word, etc. Then, and that is the second method. Then the third method, if by talking about it was probably going to lead to a worse harm, or probably you're going to find your life put in danger, then in that situation you can go for option 3, which is just hate it with your heart. Just that's the least that you can do. On the inside, I don't approve of this, but I don't have a power to change it. So that situation, that is basically in the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, من رأى منكم منكرا فليغيره بيده فإن لم يستطع فبلسانه فإن لم يستطع فبقلبه وذلك أضعف الإيمان. And that hadith is authentic. Let me see the other an underage marriage contract. So in Islam, underage, and she was here talking about Sayyida Aisha. How do you consider Sayyida Aisha? So underage in Islam, it's not an issue of number. Islam does not consider an underage to mean a number. We're talking about an underage to mean that the body has not fully developed, whether the reproductive system or even the body. That's what we mean by an underage. So it depends on the area. If, for example, you go to Africa, you would see girls at 9 and even 8 actually getting their cycle. You go to Norway, the girls would be 18 and still didn't get a cycle, right? So whether that is genetics, or whether that's the sun, or whether there are different reasons to why and how people would basically go into the different stages of puberty, there are a number of different factors. But Islam does not consider necessarily the age of 18 to be the age of maturity or the age of puberty, because the age of puberty differs from one body to another, from one society to another. So in that situation, we would make sure that the girl had actually reached the age of puberty by letting, I guess, an endocrinologist actually tell me whether the girl reached the age of puberty, or whether what stage is she, and that the pediatrician or even the endocrinologist would actually tell you, right? So, and it differs from one race to another, all right? But in Islam, underage marriage to mean not age, to mean whether the girl had fully developed. So let's call it under puberty in Islam is haram, and it is considered a penalty. It is considered against Islam to marry a girl that has not reached the age of puberty. This is what we mean by underage. Got it? Go ahead, my dear. You want to say something?
I did.
Mm-hmm.
My friend told me to ask you that. Can you explain women not being able to leave their homes without necessity?
Walaikum salam. Can you explain?
Women not being allowed to leave their homes without a need.
Fair enough. So we mentioned before in Islam, it is considered that the home is sacred. The home, fair enough, that the home is sacred. Just as we talk about every single territory, that it is to be sacred. Just like in the US, you cannot leave the US, even if you're an American citizen, without actually having a passport. You cannot enter the US without having a passport, right? Same thing for every single country. Why? It's in order to make sure that the government is responsible for its citizens. It's to make sure that whoever is leaving, whoever's entering, is basically abiding by certain laws, and is basically making sure that it's basically securing its own security and its own borders. Same thing. The home is basically going to be the smaller size of a territory of another country. So in Islam, it is considered that as the husband is the leader within the household, responsible for the household, responsible for the home security, he's responsible for anything that goes right, wrong, etc. He's going to be responsible for it. So Islam considers al-ghunmu bil-ghurm. Well, if the husband is going to be responsible to make sure that everything that goes on within the household is secure and is under his basically responsibility, then in that situation, Islam would give him the privilege to secure the borders of what comes in and what goes out. Right? What goes in and what goes out. If I want to hold the government responsible for basically our borders, at least give them the power to secure what's coming in, what's going out. Because if we're going to, here's one thing, any country that basically has no borders that are secured later on becomes not a country anymore, not a territory anymore, but it actually becomes an easy place for others to invade. for others to invade. If you don't have a border, if you're borderless, you're identityless. Anybody will come in. So that's why Islam regards that the home is also this minimized land to territory where the husband, in order to tell him to secure the home, we would give him the authority to say, well, I want to be able to know who's coming out, even if it's the wife. Are you going out? Please let me know. Because I'm going to be responsible for you if anything goes wrong. If you're coming in, I'd like to know. I'd like to know how we're spending. I'd like to know how and who's going out. I'd like to set a certain regulations within the household just so that I'm capable of making sure that the responsibility that I was asked to take care of is actually under control. That's the main reason. And it's definitely not to somehow imprison women. It's not to imprison women. It's to basically, because he's going to be responsible for her security, it's giving him the authority to make sure that he has his responsibility, that I will be holding him responsible for, that he's got everything, at least to a certain extent, under control, because I'm going to hold him responsible for it. If I'm going to be holding him responsible for it, then it's going to be fair to give him some level of authority to ensure that it's going in the right direction. Go ahead, my dear.
What if he doesn't know his rights? Like,
Too bad. If he doesn't know his rights, if he doesn't know his rights, then he doesn't know his responsibilities,
So,
right? If he doesn't know his rights, then he doesn't know his responsibilities, because these things go hand in hand. The rights are related and correlated to responsibilities. You understand what I'm saying? It's correlated. These rights, it's not just, I'm just going to give you a privilege for like that. It's not an issue of privilege. It's an issue. This is in Arabic. It's not tashrif, it's taklif. It's not an issue of privilege because you're somehow more honorable, superior. No, it is not. The man is not more superior, and certainly the woman is not inferior. When this man or this woman is given certain privileges, it's not privileges, it's certain things that Islam will give you because there's a responsibility correlated with it. It's not an issue of honor. Islam is not giving you the honor. So, Mr. Man, it's not to somehow give you more honor. It's actually to give you more responsibility. We're just facilitating the responsibility for you so that you know how to do it. That's basically it. It's not an issue of tashrif. It's not an issue of honor. It's taklif. It's a responsibility. Go ahead, my dear.
I was gonna ask, what is the ruling on women traveling in a group without a mahram?
We mentioned that one before, women traveling in a group without a mahram. We mentioned that one before, that there is a hadith with Adi ibn Hatim al-Ta'i, that Adi said when he was sitting with the Prophet, now mind you, Adi was actually a Christian and later became Muslim. The Prophet was telling him that if you were to live long enough, you will see that women, that the elderly would travel all the way from Al-Hira, which is a city in Iraq, all the way to Mecca without having anybody with her all the way to Mecca. So we're talking about a huge distance. And some scholars actually understood that as an informative clause, and others considered it that it wasn't an informative clause and considered it as, no, this is to give us an indication that if security is available, then in that situation, from that scrutiny to that hadith, you had some scholars just like Abu al-Walid al-Baji from the Maliki madhab, that did regard that if it's a group of women traveling together and security was there, and it was for, let's call it religious reasons, whether it's Hajj, Umrah, etc., they regarded that it was, if it's a group of women, or even if it's a group, let's say here from Brooklyn Park, we're going in a group of 50, we're having men and women together. So it's like a city going together, a group of 50, a group of 100, they're going together. They did consider, some of the Malikis, they did consider that that is permissible. So just wanted to note on that on a side, all right? But other scholars, they rejected that opinion, considered that, no, this hadith is not giving us that it is permissible because of the word avaina, which actually means an elderly woman. So they regarded that the hadith that said that it is not permissible for a woman that believes in Allah and Judgment Day to travel a distance of 3 days without a mahram, without a mahram. In other words, she has to have that chaperone, that her father, her brother, etc. And that wasn't at all for, yeah, somehow she just doesn't know how to be on her own. It's really to give more security. So it's a responsibility that the man, her brother, her father, etc., to be there for her, whether to give her security, to give her the help, to make sure that she's actually safe. It's not an issue of somehow patriarchy, that an authoritative father is going to be there just regulating what she does and etc. No, it's not an issue of patriarchy in the negative definition, but we're actually talking about patriarchy in the positive, from the positive stance, in where the father, the brother, is actually taking the responsibility to give the woman the security, and not to give some form of an authority where it's dismantling or abusing the woman's rights in their service. That's in Islam called the adl al-wali, and is definitely not permissible. Did I answer that one? All right. This is it.
A little.
You got any questions? No? Okay.
Sorry. So
Mhm.
so obviously that question related to the that you have to also like ask for permission from your husband, but she's more focusing on like your husband deeming something to be a necessity or not.
Say that again. I kind of
Like,
blacked out.
yeah, that so women are not supposed to leave their homes without a necessity. So she's saying what would be deemed as a necessary reason to leave the house, or I don't know, along those
Well,
lines.
going to work, going shopping, going, but even to go and just have a walk in the park, that's permissible. It doesn't have to be just for necessity, right? She just went to the park just for a walk. It doesn't have to be for necessity, all right? Just wanted to go and walk in the park. That's it, all right? It doesn't have to be for necessity.
Yeah.
Okay. So the part about not to leave them a home except for necessity, we're talking about not making the unnecessary reasons to leave the home as a common practice, like every single day, just wandering with no business and just wasting time. All right. That's the part that Islam, not just for women, but also for men. It's like, well, you got to use your time wisely. This is a question. I heard that a woman can put in the marriage contract that the man is not allowed to have a second wife. Is that true? We did answer that one before, didn't we?
Yeah, we did.
We did. We did answer in detail that question. I'll make the story short. Scholars had differences of opinions on whether that is something that she can put in the marriage contract, and the reason for that, number one, is that some scholars said that she can put it in the marriage contract that he can't marry a second wife, third wife, fourth wife, etc. Well, of course, there's no more than fourth, but anyhow, the first group of scholars said that this condition is permissible, that she can put a condition like that, and it would be haram for him to actually break that condition that he had agreed on. The second opinion says, well, the condition itself is actually invalid. This is the second opinion. Why? Not the Maliki, hold on. The second, the Hanbalis. they actually regarded that this condition is not valid because it's against the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded it as permissible. Therefore, for you to regard something as impermissible is contradicting yourself and your faith in the Quran. So I'm just laying them out. But that's why they had different interpretations on the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually said any condition that is not in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is batil, is void. And then the first group, they interpreted, well, that's to mean if that is against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like saying something is halal when it's actually haram, and the other way. The other scholars, they said that no, even if the Quran permitted something, to actually put a condition that regards it as impermissible, or at least something that, if it's halal, of course, and they regarded that in itself is regarding it as other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered it, and therefore they regarded that condition is void in the beginning. Okay, that was the Hanbali. So the Hanbali regarded that condition is actually in the core of it, contradicting the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The first group of scholars, they said, no, he's just giving up on his right. It's exactly like if I were to tell you that this water contains salt in it and you were okay with it. And you said, I still want to buy it. You knew that the water was not as purified as claimed on the bottle, but you still accepted the trade. Oh, so that's the first opinion. What's the preponderant? The Hanafi. The Hanafi, they regarded, yeah, you can put a condition. The Hanbali, they regarded that, no, you cannot put a condition like that. That's the Hanbali. What if I take one-time permission in general for all the future? What if I take, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. Her and her husband, they're both okay. He's like, as long as you're going for something, someplace halal, and I call you and you're right there, I'm at Aldi shopping, and he's okay with it, that's all right. They're both together, they're okay with it, and to him, as long as you're doing, the right thing and etc., and he knows and he trusts you, by all means, okay. That's absolutely fine. It's a one-time permission, and you guys are together. You're mutually consenting. You're mutually, understanding, communicating together. That's absolutely fine. Every single household has their way of communication. Go ahead, my dear.
At the time period of Jahiliyyah, before Islam came, like the practices people would do, like bury their girls alive and stuff. Are they going to be like held accountable for that?
Fair enough. So before the Prophet ﷺ, between the Prophet ﷺ and Prophet Isa alayhi salam, which is Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, there was a time period of almost 635 years. Okay, 635 years. During that moment, it was called al-Fatra, Ahl al-Fatra. I think they want us out. Ahl al-Fatra was basically that time frame when between the Prophet ﷺ and Prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, so they didn't actually receive a revelation, and those people will be given a second chance of being held accountable. We're done. Oh, tell them we're done. So they can lock it. Yeah, tell them we're done. Yeah, so they'll be held accountable on Judgment Day and retrialed on Judgment Day again. All right. So what about Medicaid? Hold on. Inshallah, we'll get to you all. They want to close the door, and we're definitely